From the boardroom to the locker room, sport captures the imagination like little else. In this podcast, we talk to the men and women who make the big decisions and those who make the big plays to find out where sport is and, importantly, where it's going. But we do so through the only eyes that matter, those of the fan.
Welcome everybody to another edition of Are You Not Entertained? Today it's myself and Captain Giles Morgan. We've had political upheaval in Argentina, so obviously we do not have Grant Williams. He will be making sure that gentleman there who looks like Bernard Manning on acid doesn't last very long. If you see something happen to this man, you know what has happened. I'm delighted that this is an episode of the Bucket List brought to you by Infinity Sports Travel, who are a wonderful sponsor. I think these days, the more and more that sport is becoming, for me anyway, I wrote about that in my article last week, much more of a social event, much more about people getting together, tribal. I think what they are doing in facilitating that for that part of the audience, that part of the market is really interesting. It's a really interesting company. And of course, they've helped us bring you the idea of the bucket list, which is our second episode today with a wonderful guest. And I'm going to ask the captain to introduce all of that in a second. But thanks for joining us. We never take it for granted. We're really, really grateful for your support. And at this point, I will bring in Mr. Morgan himself. Giles, how are you?
Roger, I'm very well. I had a rare weekend of proper sport watching. Sort of got myself back from Australia, sorted out kids, and therefore was able to really sort of spend some proper sofa miles watching sport. And I enjoyed very much watching the ATP, the tennis in Turin, which you'll have seen a lot of media coverage with and locally, and seeing how Djokovic still manages just at his great old age, just perhaps unquestionably now the greatest tennis player of all time, even if you're a Federer or Nadal person, what this guy has done over such a long period of time, and to beat the local boy so comprehensively, despite that local, obviously support that he had, was just, I'm in awe of Djokovic. He's never been my number one, but he is the number one, I think.
I think that's right. We watched that, Rafael and I, we watched that with a lot of interest, and kudos to the ATP. Always been giving tennis a hard time, but I thought their presentation in Italy and Turin was really good. I exchanged some views on that with Nick Bourne, and I was very, very pleasantly surprised. Obviously, Sinner being there is very interesting. And in the knockout before the final, actually beat Djokovic, but every single one of us knew that if they met again in the final, it probably wouldn't end the same. I think this Serbian is truly extraordinary. Physically, at this age, whatever he is now, he just looks like perfection physically. He turns himself out well. All his mood music, all his attitude is just so intimidating. And I think you're right, Giles. I'm with you. Not my favourite. Can't get warm about him, but goodness, the respect. There's not a lot you can't say about him. It's phenomenal.
Well, I think he looks in better shape. I mean, he was always a wonderful athlete, but watching him on Sunday in the final, his just physique is just, it's sort of perfection for tennis, and his mentality is so can-do. I mean, I think one of the things about Federer, who had the grace and the balletic skills of the athlete that he was, but he always had that mental fragility that could creep up from time to time, and you knew that sometimes it was just going to go horribly wrong, and did from time to time. Nadal, I think, was more, I think the mindset was similar to Djokovic, but sometimes the body let him down because he was putting his body under such duress and such strain and pressure. doesn't seem to be the same with Djokovic. He seems to have the mental and the physical combination that, I mean, God knows how he'll carry on going for. I mean, maybe it does suddenly come to a grinding halt, but my God, he just looked impressive. So, and I agree with you, by the way, you have been tough on tennis, and I think rightly so, but I thought the presentation of the finals and the way that the lighting was done, it looked like a show. It really looked like a show, and clearly with Italian support for Sinner, made it very compelling. It was good telly, I have to say. It was good old-fashioned telly. Enjoyed that.
Yeah, I agree with that. So kudos, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, both to the ATP, to Turin, to Sinner, and obviously to Norrie, who begrudgingly we have to say is just a phenomenon.
Absolutely. And then the other thing that caught my eye, Rog, when I didn't realise that the ICC Cricket World Cup final being played in India, that the stadium they play it in is the biggest stadium in the world. I think it's 135,000 people in Ahmedabad. And I mean, so many things to unpack out of that, because the Australians were not favourite going into the match, but they've played some extraordinary matches recently. And Travis Head in particular scored a century that completely confounded the bookies, certainly, legitimate or otherwise. And to see, I mean, I felt for the Indian crowd because it was their home final and so much expectation. But once again, that interesting Greek word hubris comes into play, where sport can deliver hubris like nothing else other than maybe Mr. Icarus all those years ago. Just amazing that the Australians just thumped them. And that crowd was sitting there in stony silence, and you felt for them. But at the same time, go sport, unscripted drama. There's going to be, and in a 2-horse race, fabulous.
No, but I think you've hit exactly on what I saw when I saw that stadium and I saw the result coming in and everything like that. And the cold shower effect of so many people. The only other time I've experienced it really up close was Italia 90 in the semi-final. Italia, Napoli, Argentina, which obviously was very bizarre because Maradona's town playing that game, and then they lost Italy on penalties, and it was just. And you know what? Sometimes that's what sport is all about. You know, it's the pain of such a dramatic loss that keeps it honest for me. You know, and I do believe that because I've just been spending a lot of time in the last 6 months writing about sport from all different angles to try and get this book over the line and everything like that. And you know, at the end of the day, it's about losers and fans of losers, because even arithmetically, they massively outnumber the winners. So, you know, I just start getting around my head the idea that losing in a big occasion the way India did is right, is what sport does. And it can't be ever taken into the Netflix Cup type idea of entertainment and think that that's going to compete. To take Grant's point, it may get you some quick clicks and wins and audience and all of that for a while. But the reality of sport is the pain that those Indian cricket fans felt. And as you say, go sport. That is why we are the special product.
I think that's right, Roger. We saw it in the Rugby World Cup just a month or so ago. Everybody, you know, the dream scenario would clearly have been the French being the hosts. They'd put out an amazing side, but they didn't. The Irish, probably everybody else's second team in terms of phenomenal support, brilliant attitude of the fans, but not to be. And as much as we can bemoan that, and people are probably still sulking, and I understand why, you can never have it any other way, because the moment that if sport is not as unscripted drama, sport ceases to be sport. And that is its magic ingredient. And so we've seen it now twice with two home fans bitterly disappointed. It's been quite happy. I'm quite happy I'm neutral, so I didn't feel it personally, but very aware of it. But it's also given me great comfort to see 135,000 baying fans in a Coliseum. it's still there. People are still there for those big events and what we would call, and fittingly for this show, bucket list events.
Yes, indeed. And you know, that brings us on beautifully to our guest, Giles. Why don't you tell us a little bit about who we've got today to talk about bucket lists and travelling for sport, and give us a little bit of background to the wonderful person that joins us today.
Yeah, I'm delighted that we've invited Matt Tait, who, for those who remember their rugby, is a stalwart. I think he played 279 club games for his clubs in Sale and Leicester and the Newcastle Falcons. But he also played for 5 years for the England Rugby team. He represented his country in the World Cup final in 2007 against South Africa. England were unsuccessful in that bid. Seems to be a story on repeat. But he was also, I think I'm right, he was one of the very earliest capped players. He was only 18 when he got selected for his country. So
yes, I read that.
A wonderful product of Newcastle University, my alma mater, and someone who gave his all to a sport as a young professional. And then when he hung up his boots in 2018, very much wanted to focus in sport as his business, as his professional career, which is why he, I think, is such an interesting guest for us. Yes, he has the chops and the kudos as a former athlete, but he's spent the last 5 or 6 years, he worked for Oakwell Sports Advisory, who we both know, learning his trade, his craft in terms of corporate advisory work to understand the commercial structure of sport. And he worked for Andrew Umbers and he was a wonderful ambassador for that great company. And then I think a year ago, he was plucked out of really probably, from him, it was probably came out of nowhere, to work for Emirates, who own the Dubai Sevens rugby tournament, which I know a fair amount about, to be their general manager. And talk about great timing of someone who understands the commercial structures of sport, understands his sport, but also I suspect understands how sevens, on one hand in Dubai, is the beating heart of the Middle East, as the Dubai Sevens absolutely is, but within the context of World Sevens, which has never really lit the touch paper of the sport, even though it's in the Olympic Games. So a wonderful opportunity for Matt that I'm dying to hear how he's going a year in, but also a wonderful segue for us to talk about what is a bucket list event. Why do they get to be called that? Why do people put them on their bucket list? But also, for me, there are events that maybe historically have been bucket list events. And I'm thinking, again, this may be shot down in flames, but hey, that's the point of the podcast, that for me, growing up, the FA Cup final would have been the ultimate bucket list event. I'm now not convinced it necessarily is with football fans. So how do you lose that mantle, and how do you retain it? How do you keep the excitement going? And that's just the point of this series, as we look to people coming in from all sorts of different sports where bucket list events are. But I think Matt will be a great second guest for this series. I'm delighted, as you said, Infinity Sports Travel has sponsored this show because they deliver people to bucket lists. But interestingly, I suspect after the Rugby World Cup in France, I think they sold out every single boat they did. I think there were 2,000 or 3,000 people on every boat. I suspect the guys who run the company are still recovering from light alcohol poisoning and exhaustion, but I wish them well, and we look forward to working with them in the future. But anyway, let's bring Matt onto the show. Matt, a very, very warm welcome to Are You Not Entertained? I'm delighted to have you on the show. We've wanted you on for a little while, and I'm particularly grateful. I think it's only about 10 days or so, or a week or so until the Dubai Sevens, which means I imagine you're absolutely manic trying to get the event absolutely à point, as they say in France. So thank you for joining us.
No worries, absolute pleasure.
Before we get going, and there's so many things I want to talk to you about, particularly in the sort of this whole idea of a bucket list event, and having been to the Dubai Sevens about 10 times, it's right up there. Even though I've been there, I keep wanting it to be on my bucket list. It's so much fun and such a brilliant event. But before we do that, let's just talk about another bucket list event that many people will have enjoyed over the last 6 to 8 weeks, which has been the Rugby World Cup. brilliantly held by the French, despite the British media trying to grumble about queue sizes, which I didn't see at all. But that's the British media. Let's find a story. As a former England rugby player and as someone who loves the game as you do, what was your perspective living as you do in Dubai? I know you went to a couple of the games, but how was it as a barometer for the game of rugby globally? How was the French edition of the 23 World Cup?
No, I think I was very fortunate. I got out for the third and fourth playoff and for the final, so towards the business end. But from my point of view, I enjoyed the event. As you touched on, Giles, the French know how to do an event properly. There was a few snags at the start. I think in terms of a spectacle and a showcase for rugby, I think probably the quarterfinals were possibly the pinnacle of the tournament, with some fantastic games across that, which probably comes to the point around the timing of the draw being when it was so far out from the event, and I'm sure that's something that World Rugby will look at. I think in terms of this kind of balance and the use of the video referees as well, there is still some issues in and around that. There's this sort of age-old problem that rugby has now as it looks to make itself safer. This kind of the product versus protection of players and the kind of sanitisation of the product and how best to go about that. And I still don't quite think they've got that right. There's some of the inconsistencies that I know were frustrations to some of the players. So for those watching, I empathise with that. I still think the challenge with rugby as a game, and I say this as someone that spent so long playing it, it's inherently quite complicated. And in this kind of evolution of the game to try and make it safer, at times it feels like it's becoming overcomplicated for overcomplicated's sake, which when you were trying to attract new audiences can become pretty difficult, would be my assessment.
Do you think do you get the sense that fans are getting frustrated by that complexity because, as you say, they're hell-bent on making the game safer because it has to be, but at the same time leaving fans somewhat behind? Is that something that people talk to you about?
Yeah, I think in the core markets and with rugby fans, they get it because they're kind of bought into the sport already. The challenge comes when you're trying to attract new fans from new countries. There's so many nuances to the game, and this is like, I'm talking as an ex-player here. Sometimes I get confused by what's going on and can't quite decipher what's going on. So when you're trying to attract new fans to the sport, sometimes the on-field product can be difficult to decipher. I think World Rugby did actually a very good job, and I know there was some people have probably different opinions to this. I thought the entertainment in and around the actual on-field, particularly at the Stade de France where I was, I enjoyed it. The music and everything else, that kind of the peripheral piece, the more Americanization of the product, I actually quite enjoyed it. But again, your traditional fans might not enjoy that. But it's this battle between the traditional and the diehards. And France is a diehard market, right, in terms of the rugby piece. And were World Rugby always going to smash it out of the park with a World Cup in France? I think they probably were. I think the challenge comes moving forward in 2027 when you move to Australia. Yes, it's always been a relatively successful team, but actually in terms of a market for rugby union, it's a relatively peripheral sport, notwithstanding the Aussies know how to deliver an event. But I think it's going to be a challenge, and just the general state of rugby union in Australia. Eddie Jones has gone, I see Hamish McLennan's gone, so the game itself in Australia has got a lot to do, and they're taking the pinnacle event and the event that underpins the kind of the finances of the global governing body to Australia in 2027. So I think it's in an interesting spot.
Matt, let me ask you about that phrase you used there, that finances the game. I think for most non-rugby people, certainly the non-super core fan, there's been a lot of perplexity about how this tournament went on for 2 months, and for at least half of that, I think there wasn't an awful lot of what's called jeopardy these days. It was struggling to get to, as you say, its pinnacle in the quarterfinals. You're now involved very much in getting the appeal in the product market of an event, a rugby event. What is the other side of the argument that says that 2 months was the right way to structure this tournament?
I guess the opposite argument would be the growth of the game and giving the opportunities to those more peripheral tier 2 fringe nations to have a shot. Is that, again, we're talking about product, does it, to your point, Roger, dilute the product? And we move forward to 2027, they're actually talking about, World Rugby talking about an increase in the number of teams from 20 to 24. So it's this, yes, it's giving more opportunities to some of these fringe countries, but then are they correctly prepared as they move into these bigger competitions to play against the likes of the New Zealands, the Englands, the Frances, the Irelands, the kind of the tier 1 nations? And under the new calendar that World Rugby have recently announced, what the appropriate name is, I think it's the global competition, effectively this Nations Championship. The narrative coming out that it's going to provide more opportunities, but actually there's the potential that it doesn't kick in until 2026, the competition itself, and there's no relegation and promotion between the two tiers until 2030. So actually are there still going to be limited opportunities for these tier 2 nations to play more regularly against the better tier 1 nations? Then leading into these World Cups, are they going to be appropriately prepared? That becomes the challenge.
Matt, I don't want to seem as if it's a rugby thing here, because everything I'm saying applies also to football. The theme of the more teams participating in a World Cup demanding a bigger part of the calendar, that leads into club versus country issues, that leads into injuries. It's very common also in football. We've just had the international weekends. A lot of players have been lost to their clubs, like Gavi of Barcelona. So I want to ask you, and this is my own view about rugby, about football, about anything. I believe less is more. I believe that our product in sport is oversaturated. I'm not talking about yours, because yours is the complete opposite, short and sharp, bang. But you know what I'm saying here? We seem to be addressing the issue of a fuzzy product market fit by trying to throw more games at things, whereas maybe the absolute answer is to strip it right back. And rugby has maybe got 8 teams, maybe a couple of wild cards. A soccer World Cup has got 12 teams with maybe 4 wild cards. That kind of thinking, is that ever anything that you've heard discussed with any kind of credibility in the sport?
It's not, and candidly, I'm not necessarily privy to those conversations, but I definitely think there is some merit in looking at that, quality over quantity piece. And actually, probably in the club game, we're seeing that potentially play out with the demise of certain clubs, the game trying to support too big a player pool, too many clubs. Kind of a bit Darwinian, but with 3 clubs going under last year, which is obviously very sad that people lose their jobs. But it shows that the game is potentially at the club level at least overstretched itself.
I think that's really important, because the record will show. I've always been a big fan of the idea of rugby as a sport and as a product. Even though it's not my sport, I recognise it's got massive advantages over others in terms of what it represents, its ethos, the way it carries itself, everything like that. But I look around and it clearly hasn't found a model either at the club game, either in the hemisphere, north and south balance, the calendar, and everything we're talking about here, tragically with a lot of historic names gone. What is the reason for that? Is it simply that players ended up getting paid too much because for a period of time there was benefactors that just said, I'll pick up the tab? Is it because they never faced into what the business with revenues and costs always should have been? Is it as simple as that?
I definitely think there's an element of that. And if we look potentially, this COVID has a part to play, but there's a big piece that precedes that, and a big piece is around the benefactors. And for me, there was a cap, there was a salary cap there that was meant to control costs and maintain a level playing field. And whether everyone stuck to that, can be argued or not. I think one of the biggest issues, and I forget the date at which it was introduced, was the marquee player. I guess this ability for chairman to go, I'm going to sign a cheque because I want to sign, I don't know, Dan Carter, for example. And to a certain extent, players and agents accepted that, I think, because it was recognition that these players are additive to the team performance, they're additive to the overall appeal of the league. But then the introduction of the second marquee player, all of a sudden you then have agents and players going, well, if he's worth 500,000 as a second marquee, well, I'm only getting paid half of that. Well, actually, my market value is 300,000, 350,000, and all of a sudden you kind of multiply that out across a squad of 40 first team players. Then all of a sudden you've got a significant issue on your hand, and that certainly didn't help. Crowds, I think, have been relatively stable. Broadcast revenues have been relatively stable without necessarily going up. And then obviously the CVC bought into PRL as a Premiership Rugby just pre-COVID. Talk about kind of the perfect storm, and there's the distributions for allowing CVC to buy into those future revenue streams were supposed to grow the businesses of the clubs. But actually, I think all that happened was it ended up supporting those clubs through cash flow issues during COVID, and they come out the other side and actually there isn't the money to necessarily invest in the business. We're in a kind of more of a macroeconomic climate now where people are having to watch the pennies, particularly back in the UK as well. And there's a bit of a perfect storm that's been created.
Matt, if you could look back on not just your own career, but there was obviously the amateur era, there was the quasi-amateur era that the French and the Welsh particularly loved, which was we're amateur, but we'll make sure that people get paid. Then the game went into a professional era, and it was total chaos. So we went into this era, as you said, this era of the benefactor. If you could have picked any time to play rugby, you did something that I am absolutely in awe of. You played for your country in a sport that I love, something that was never going to happen. If you could choose any era to have played rugby in, when would it have been?
To be honest, probably the era I did, because I retired in 2019, just before there was all the wage cuts. I mean, I played through what was a growth and a boom period for the sport, really, certainly in terms of the salaries available to players. And we're not talking football wages, but we're talking to be able to sustain a nice standard of living. I started playing in 2004, my first game for Newcastle Falcons.
And how old were you then? You were very, very young on that.
I was 18. Yeah, I was in the middle of my A levels. So I took a bit of time out of revision to go and play for them. Played through 2004, and then I went straight from school into professional sport. I remember at the time thinking I was flush with cash on my, I think it was £8,000 a year or something I was earning at Newcastle, having gone straight from school. So, but in terms of I do genuinely think the era in which I've come through, it was probably a little bit Wild West on the injury and the head injury side of things, which is something that now is, and some of that's driven by players as well, I think. And there's definitely been a change in the psyche of players. At the time, it was probably seen as a bit more of a badge of honour that you could carry on with knocks, and that's both physical and to the head as well, and not wanting to let your teammates down. But actually, there's been and rightly so, a change in both players looking after themselves, but also there's so much more protection to players. Head injury assessments, independent doctors present at every match is to kind of mitigate as much as it is humanly possible with what is a physical support. And it comes back to my point I made at the start, that it's this fight between protection of the players, sanitisation of the product, and part of that is understanding that part of the reason people want to watch rugby is the combat and the physical nature of it. It's that kind of gladiatorial element of the sport that people, the confrontational part of the sport that people enjoy watching, that makes it interesting.
Well, let me shift a bit, because we're here partly to talk about you. We're partly here to talk about bucket list events, of which I have always maintained that the Dubai Sevens, if you live in the Middle East, in particular, particularly as an expat, this is the must-go event. It really is brilliant, very much similar to how, if you live in the Far East, how the Hong Kong Sevens, two extraordinary city-state events that certainly transcend the sport of rugby sevens. They are much bigger than the collective of the series. And something that I think I'm right in saying Dubai Sevens started in 1970. It's even older than the UAE, which is astonishing, the formation of the UAE. But I would also say, as someone who way back when in 2009 played quite an influential role, I pompously like to think, with both rugby and golf becoming part of the Olympic movement. And I think it would be fair, if not necessarily universally loved by people at World Rugby, that as much as it's exciting that Rugby Sevens has come to the Olympic Games, and there have been some nice iterations of it, the touch paper of the sport has not gone global, and that Rugby Sevens, despite it being an easier format, men and women play, it's fast and furious, it doesn't require the technical know-how of referee judgment, etc., that this is a product that still has not uniformly taken over. And yet, that in Hong Kong and the Dubai Sevens, the Emirates Dubai Sevens that you look after, these are absolutely adopted by communities. These are must-attend social events. These are events that people pay a lot of money to come and watch and to have a brilliant time. So it feels almost like the tail wags the dog in Rugby Sevens. And I wondered, after a year in post, there you are in Dubai, what's your perception of where Sevens is? And then talk a little bit about the nature of why it has become so beloved in the region, and what you're going to do to keep taking it forward and to keep maintaining the pressure that every event has, which is there's always another event round the corner. Yeah,
well, I mean, the format of Sevens for me is I just love it, and it's got, my playing days allowed me to almost get back on the horse after an infamous debut in 2005. It provided me with a bit of an opportunity to just, sounds a bit dramatic, but fall back in love with the game a little bit again. I was very fortunate that Newcastle saw the value in allowing me at the time to go and play on the World Series across the 2005-2006 event, and I played in Dubai, and it was George as it was at the time, now down into Cape Town, and then the Commonwealth Games in Melbourne, through to Hong Kong, Singapore, with a training camp in Bali for a week, which was really nice. But essentially the game of Sevens is the stripped back format of rugby. And the reason I loved playing the game, which was to be able to put your core skills under pressure and to take people on one-on-one. And that's, I guess, part of the mystery as to potentially why it hasn't kicked off as potentially as much as it should, because it removes a lot of barriers to participation, in the sense you don't need as many players. It's actually... It's more around the athleticism and the skill, rather than necessarily understanding a lot of the tactical nuances. Obviously there is going to be some tactical nuances, and the coaches, I'm sure, involved in the series will kill me for that. But it's not like 15s where you've got the nuances of an 8-man scrum, the ruck and mauls, the line-outs, all the rest of it, that actually end up slowing the game down. So it's this it's a format that is dear to my heart, and I was obviously very, very pleased to get the job out here. In terms of the Dubai Sevens event, as you rightly point out, Giles, it's 53 years now that the event has been here, and evolved from an event in the sandpit at the Exiles Rugby Club to this massive multi-purpose facility built by Emirates in 2008. And there's quite this nice parallels of the growth and the evolution of Dubai under the vision of Sheikh Mohammed to the Sevens as well. It's these two kind of have run in parallel, the evolution from something built from the desert under the vision of him, and I'm very fortunate to be able to.
And why? Let's pick at that. So obviously Dubai has grown as a culture, as a city. It's become an international trade hub. All of the things that we know. Do you think that therefore the Sevens has just grown to be a mirror of that, a kind of receptacle which says, right, well, you're here for business, and here's an event, and it's getting bigger, and there's going to be free flowing food and drink. It's all going to be great fun. Do you think it's just been a mirror, a societal mirror, and is that actually what all bucket list events are. You know, the original Open Championship, I don't suppose, had 150,000 people at St Andrews. I suspect 8 people and a sheep watched the original versions, and it grew as the game grew. Do you think that a lot of what bucket list events become is just the sort of repetition over time in history of calendar events that just take people along and grow imperceptibly year after year?
I think there's definitely an advantage to having that kind of fixed position in a calendar, and it just knowing that it's repeating year on year. And for Dubai in particular, it's around the National Day weekend, which is always towards the end of November, December. So everyone, whether new to Dubai or been here for a long time, knows that the Emirates Dubai Sevens is on during the National Day weekend. I think that with all of the bucket list events, there's an element of kind of history, tradition, and heritage, but underpinned by a kind of an evolution to maintain that relevance. I think if these events don't continue to evolve and iterate themselves based on changing demographics of cities or the regions that they're trying to attract and the age demographics they're trying to attract, then they can see themselves fall away. And that, is part of the reason around the evolution of the Emirates Dubai Sevens as it is now. It was the Dubai Rugby Sevens, but that was a deliberate dropping of rugby from the name by one of my predecessors, was actually to say that, we'll always celebrate the fact that rugby is the foundations upon which the event is built. And actually there's still a huge part of our audience want that. But the demographics and the expectations of Dubai as a sporting community, but also to attract people down to the event that might not necessarily be interested in sport, but we can get them down because we've got, we've got fantastic F&B, we've got fantastic music, fantastic entertainment on that sits around the peripheral. And actually it's just a case of wanting to bring people together for that collective experience and that shared experience. And that can be as an old ex-Duffer player like me that's coming out to play with his mates to catch up in the Invitational Rugby Tournament, or it could be a family that are coming down to have their first experience of playing paddle as it was this year. And that's the reason we've added, in and around the World Series, we've got 5 invitational sports now. So we have our rugby with 180 plus invitational teams flying in from all over the globe, kind of this annual pilgrimage that a lot of them make because they know it's in their calendar at a fixed point into Dubai, in the centre of the planet, to have this amazing experience. We've got netball, which is growing year on year, 85 plus teams this year, teams flying in from America to take part. Cricket, introduced 3 years ago to tap into this big Southeast Asian, Indian, Pakistani population that call Dubai home. And then CrossFit, our WOD-on competition, which is essentially a functional fitness competition, last year, and we've introduced paddle this year, or padel, I think, as you call it on your podcast. So, yeah, we've introduced that.
Matt, let me ask something about all of this, because I was in a meeting the other day and somebody said something very interesting. They said, all this talk about Saudi and sport now, they said Dubai is still where it's at when you cut everything back. Give us an insight into however you want to describe the rivalry between Qatar, the Saudi cities, Neom, Qadiyah, that are coming up, and the granddaddy, which is obviously Dubai. You've been there not a long time now, but enough. How do you feel that Dubai is living this latest iteration of what seems Saudi-dominated sport?
I think actually the ties between Saudi and Dubai are strong, and I think that there's enough sport assets globally that there's enough for everyone to kind of feed at that table. The reality is, Saudi's investing what it's investing to, I guess, in a way, replicate what Dubai did a little while ago. And there's close collaboration cities between the countries. From a trade perspective, and from my point of view and what I'm seeing is actually it's almost complementary, because all it does is reinforce the Middle East as this global hub for sport. obviously a lot of attention is around that in Dubai, but Emirates, I think, still remains the biggest sponsor of sport globally, and was the first mover to see the value of owning a number of key sports sponsorship assets. But I don't see it necessarily as competing. I think it's complementary, and I think it adds to showcasing the ability of the entire region, not just Dubai, UAE, I include Dubai, Abu Dhabi in that as well, Qatar, and obviously Saudi Arabia. I think it just reinforces that this is a place to come if you are a sports entity. Yeah.
But before we get into specific bucket lists that we've all got, I saw a story today, and again, I repeat, I'm not a rugby guy, but this strikes me, and I've got good antenna for this. This strikes me as one hell of a story. The name I'm going to mention to you is Antoine Dupont. Now, if I'm you laugh. If I'm correct, this is a chap, a serious rugby player who's going to relinquish playing in the Six Nations to allow him to get ready for the Olympics, where, if I'm not wrong, he will be playing sevens. Now, if that's correct, and I'm reading that correctly, that kind of encapsulates all the things we talked about in the first half of this podcast about the challenges of the sport and getting itself together and finding space and priorities and who gets what and who gets paid for what. Is this not one hell of a big story that's going to be a cold shower for a lot of people, Matt?
Yeah, I think it is. I've not seen it announced that that's definitely happening as yet, but it's been rumoured for a period of time. I think it probably showcases the strength of the Olympics and the Olympic peel and the ability for sevens to be part of the Olympics. Dupont's won a Six Nations. He's won a top 14 with Toulouse. He obviously hasn't won a World Cup because they got knocked out during the World Cup. So for him, it's around being able to, when you look back at a career, the Olympics is one thing that not many people that potentially have on a medal around their neck, and if he sees an opportunity to do that, I think it's probably, it's a great opportunity for him. It's a great opportunity for the sport of sevens to be able to leverage his profile. I know Michael Hooper is the same recently, so the ex-Australia captain, he's going to be playing for the Australian sevens team. I don't think that's going to be till later in the year. So I think the transition of some of these players over is primarily driven by the Olympics, but it's a great opportunity for the sport to leverage them coming in. I think the challenge that sevens has now, because it's so specialised, is for some of those star players to kind of dip in and out for the odd event. So when I was on the series, it was seen primarily as a development tool. Almost like a bit of a finishing school for certain types of players. And as the game became more specialised, the transition across and the value was questioned by a number of the unions. There are still some unions that do it, South Africa and the likes of Cheslin Colby and some of those guys that have successfully made the transition, but they've done it having been on the series for an extended period of time, so they can
Matt, can I ask you, because I can only reference to what would happen in football. In football, a player hasn't got the choice whether to turn up for his national team or not. They get called, and if they don't, all hell breaks loose. They can't play for their club and everything. What happens in rugby? Can he just willy-nilly say, I'm not turning up for the Six Nations, and nothing happens?
I think it depends on the unions, because there's various different models that exist across the different unions. So it would be more challenging within the PRL, because it's ultimately the clubs are the ultimate paymasters, but they do obviously get a payment from the RFU through the professional game agreement. In France, I suspect he's probably got enough WASTA, because it is actually the clubs that there's a closer relationship, but it is actually the clubs that are the main paymaster. But I think possibly Dupont's got enough, to coin a UAE term, the WASTA, to be able to say that I want to be able to do this. And
but Matt, let me ask you. As a rugby player, someone who's played both formats of the game very, very successfully. But sevens has moved on. It's very specialised, as you referenced earlier. I remember taking Daley Thompson to watch the England set up in 2016, and he said, I can't believe it. I've just seen a squad of 10 sevens players he was watching for England were effectively 10 decathletes. He was blown away by the athleticism. is there a potential that Dupont, as brilliant a 15-a-side player as he undoubtedly is there a chance that he won't be good enough to play sevens because he's not specialised?
I don't doubt from a skill sets wise he'll be good enough. He's one of the best players from a skill set perspective in the world. I think it's the conditioning is so different, and this is why he'll be coming in relatively soon to be able to go on a specialised programme to get him sevens fit. I remember I dropped in 2004, end of 2004, having just been training for 15s to then play sevens in the December that year, and I'm coughing up my lungs at some point on the Exiles ground after about 2 minutes, just because it is so different. So it is going to take him a period of time. And there's many a 15s player has tried to make the transition across for some of these major events, the likes of Matt Gitto, Chris Latham in 2006 at the Com Games, Quade Cooper, tried and played a little bit on the Sevens circuit, but again, dropping in and out. So I think the fact that Dupont is coming in much earlier into the season to allow him to get specifically fit is I guess testament to him that he's willing to make that call from a career perspective, because he thinks he can cut the mustard.
And Matt, let me just, before we get on to your own bucket list, because I'm always fascinated, it's the ultimate pub conversation. But before then, we sit with the new series. You're about to launch the new series. Dubai is the first of the new HSBC. I've still got it. I still remember the title sponsor, World Rugby Sevens sponsor. And it's seven tournaments, men and women, grand final in Madrid, which has raised a few eyebrows, but great city to go to. You obviously kick things off and will kick it off, as you do every year, spectacularly well. And then I think it's Cape Town next, if I'm right? And that's correct, always, obviously, fantastic stadium down there in Greenpoint, and the South Africans love their rugby, and that will be great. And then there's been a little bit of a sort of fizz, and who gives a damn about some of the tournaments until Uncle Hong Kong comes back and picks up the mantle again and shakes it again. I'm sounding cynical, I'm not. I just know sevens as well as I know anything. Are you excited? And I don't mean you to toe the party line. What can World Rugby learn from Dubai to help them with their cherished series to become the sport that we all know it should be?
Well, I think, looking at how World Rugby has revamped the new format of the series, it's a compliment to both ourselves and Hong Kong that how they've done that. The challenge with sevens is, with all sport, it's where does it generate its money to sustain itself? Sevens isn't a broadcast product, and there's been this realisation by World Rugby that they need to do more in and around celebrating and showcasing the event, and that's kind of where that's going to focus is in and around the sport, music and entertainment, food, and then the mass participation piece. So I'm really looking forward to seeing how that is replicated across all the other events. I think the Jeopardy in Madrid, I think, is an interesting change in that there's the ability for those challenger nations to be promoted to the World Series. And when you were talking about growth of the game and accessibility, it gives that immediate accessibility to some potentially these more peripheral nations where their primary touch point with the sport of rugby is through sevens and the funding that's available through the fact it's an Olympic sport. So I'm excited to see what that looks like. And from our perspective, this has been my second event under my guys.
You've got some good bands coming, good bands, DJs coming, or have you announced those, or are you holding fire? Is there
No, we've got those. So I think you'll be a big fan of Becky Hill and MK Giles. I know they're right up your street.
Absolutely, always, every day on my playlist, every day.
And then we've got Artful Dodger and DJ Luck and MC Neat. So that's they're probably more for people of a certain heritage. I think is very. Looking forward to kind of kicking it all off. And as always, actually, it gets really exciting at the end of this week as the World Series teams start to fly in, and we have our invitational teams start to come into buy and into market, and it becomes very, very real and tangible at that point.
Okay, Matt, let's spend the last 5-10 minutes talking a little bit about bucket lists and kind of things that you still want to you talked about the Formula One a little bit, and that is very interesting because we just had Las Vegas, and it goes back to a lot of the points you were talking about making an event, and the traditionalists not liking the track, and all of that kind of stuff. You're uniquely placed here as an ex-pro athlete. Where are the ones that you really think you would still like to go to in the next few years before they all ultimately change into some version of metaverse and Nickelodeon type broadcasting? Old school, where are the bucket list events for you?
I think they're still the big traditional ones for me. So I'm a big fan of American sport. So the NBA, I'd love to go to some of the NBA finals, Super Bowl, which I know is also on your bucket list as well, Giles. And as we were touching on just before, I think before we came online, I'm very lucky that I'm going to the Abu Dhabi Grand Prix this weekend on Sunday as a guest. So I get to do the full pit walk, the full shebang, which is there's always been on my bucket list, because I think F1 does it right, notwithstanding Max Verstappen's comments about Vegas over the weekend. I guess it's potentially more in reference to the traditionalist. I'm not necessarily a traditional F1 fan. I used to watch it fleetingly, was sucked in by Drive to Survive, and now
there you go. Isn't that interesting?
Have the bug to just get more into the weeds and the behind the scenes piece, which is actually something we're copying this year for the Emirates Dubai Sevens. We're doing a bit of a behind the scenes documentary just to showcase and educate people about everything else that goes on in and around the event apart from the rugby. X-rated, I guess, heavily edited. No comment.
Aftershave and things like that. If you cut all that out, all you've got left is about 3 minutes of footage.
No comment, Roger.
Yeah, I'm interested in what you said earlier, Matt, about bucket lists, though, and how there is this clever, sensitive balance between the heritage and history, which provides the kind of narrative of the past, but also the need for events to make sure that they keep contemporizing, can not be arrogant enough to think that everything is fine because it was fine last year and therefore the same old people will come. You'll know, as a listener of the podcast, Roger is always talking about young people, consumption. How do you bring them in? What is the way to do it? Whether it be music, whether it be looking at formats, whether it be looking about ticketing policy for live events, whatever it is, to stand still is dangerous. And I imagine when you took the job, that must have been the thing that probably the excitement of working for a great sporting event with everything it came with. But the pressure for you and for your team is to make sure that you're always one step ahead of the others.
Yeah, no, exactly that. And that was a big opportunity that did excite me. I think the really interesting piece about Dubai is, and you've touched on it, is just how competitive a market is. There's literally, we open up for peak season, there is a music festival or music event or sporting event either in Dubai or Abu Dhabi every weekend. So for us to sort of sit on our laurels and because it worked last year, it'll work again this year, was just not the case. And that was started by my predecessor, and is something I'm very much taking forward. And that's the reason we've introduced additional sports. And it is engaging that age demographic. The Dubai demographic is very skewed, this 18 to 45-ish. And it's engaging with that audience. And what do they want? Well, it's experiences, and that can be both as a social at the bar, having food, or it can actually be participating in a sport as part of something that's much bigger than that. And that also resonates with a lot of what Dubai is doing as part of the 2040 vision, which is celebrating health and wellness and about being the fittest city. We're just coming, to the end of the Dubai 30 and 30. There's a real focus in the city around the health and the health of its inhabitants. So for us, it's around how we connect with that audience, and it is the sports, but it's also there's the entertainment piece, and it is the platforms with which we engage. So we do a lot more now than we historically did on. It's the social platforms, it's the Instagrams, it's the TikToks, and it's tailoring content to be relevant to those audiences. I'm very lucky. I've got in-house team that does that.
I was going to say, do you have a very good social media team to help you with your TikTok account?
Yeah, we do. It's definitely not my forte. I won't be on there singing or dancing, I can assure you. But yeah, I'm very lucky that I've got a good team that are doing that. We have our own first-party database through our own ticketing platform we have for the event. So we have there's a foundations there for us to kind of commercialise and leverage more what we're doing.
Well, and I think aware a little bit of what you're doing, and I think so much of how Dubai has always approached sport as an innovator, as a disruptor, and even if you're 53 years young this year, I fully expect and hope to see the Dubai Sevens as a preeminent event within the social calendar. And I think on behalf of me and Roger in particular, with obviously having this chat with you, genuinely wish you all the very best of luck in the next week or so. It's a huge event, and for anyone who is still wondering what to do with their air miles, and if you can get a ticket from Emirates Airline to come down, go. It is so much fun. And Matt, best of luck with that, and also a huge thank you for coming on the show, as I say, with these rather tight timelines you're under, and sharing your own perspective. We really appreciate it.
No, absolute pleasure. And if either of your diaries free up, you're more than welcome to come and join us in Dubai.
I will take you, maybe not this year, but I will definitely take you up on that. Definitely.
Well, maybe we could do a live show, Matt, from Dubai in 2025. Roger doesn't drink much, so he'd be fine. He runs a very short bar tab. I, on the other hand, am absolute terror.
That's fine. Short pockets is what I hear about you, though. No, long pockets, short.
And fair point. Matt, thank you very much. Lovely to see you.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks for your time. I know it's a busy time. Thank you.
Take care. Cheers, guys.
Really enjoyed that, Giles. Lovely chap. Really, really lovely chap.
Very understated, and I think I know he's always listened to the podcast, and we've talked about a lot of the themes. I'm always really encouraged when I see the management of events who are clearly they've got their finger on the pulse. He's thinking about it. There is not an ounce of complacency about what the Dubai Sevens are trying to do. I think he was courteous enough to say that the Dubai Sevens and Hong Kong Sevens, I think World Rugby owe a huge debt of gratitude to both those events for for shoring things up, and now for their new launch of a new series. Hopefully we'll start to see real growth, because they have led the way, and they are listening to the kind of themes that we've been talking about, and others, about how you keep contemporizing, modernizing, and also commercializing what you've got. And particularly when you're an event that doesn't and can't rely on television revenue, what are your other revenue streams? What are you going to do to bring people in? And I think they have absolutely crushed it. And I'm really sad I can't go this year, but I think we've just hopefully managed to get ourselves a live gig for next year at the Dubai Sevens, and providing 007 or 8 or whatever his name is isn't sorting out some other sort of feud in another part of the world, maybe he can join us as well.
That would be a lot of fun. And this series that's been financed by Infinity Sport Travel, actually, as it goes along, makes me think a little bit more. Maybe there's not just one collective noun for bucket list anymore. It's my theme. There's not one collective noun for anything in sport anymore. I see what we do in the restaurant business, that there is an element of experience, vibe, coolness, just going to an event because it is the place to be. And then there's bucket lists that you have to go to because there is something very, very historical about them. And maybe we shouldn't think about making both of those things join up in the middle. Maybe they are two completely different things. If I think of the Crucible in Sheffield, where you went to this year, that's bucket list for me. I've never been. And I wouldn't need it to be having the DJ set, in between, because that would be a bucket list in itself. However, we saw in Las Vegas with the Formula One and some of the things that Matt's doing there, that you do have to work slightly differently for a different audience. And Dubai, in every way, well outside of sport as well, is a different audience. And I am fascinated about how Dubai and the rivalries with Qatar and Saudi play out. I think that is one of the the teams that isn't talked about a lot. Dubai, I'm not an expert on the Arab world, but I think there's a whole lot of respect between them about how they operate with each other and what they say to each other and what they don't say. And I think Dubai and all of this, like last year and a half of Saudi being there and everywhere, Dubai's been respectfully saying not very much and just getting on with it. And I think Matt's a great example of that.
Absolutely. And I think what he's talked about the region, it's the region becoming this power hub for so much is where this is all, a lot of this is heading. But I also agree with you what you said. There are certain events which are the purest form, which is you go to the Crucible, it's a snooker crowd, you're watching something that is entirely and all about snooker. But rather like my experience at the Melbourne Cup that I shared with you guys last week, this is a very old event. It's over 150 years old. It's all about tradition and heritage, but with an Aussie twist, which means they've got live music. There are a lot of people who will not see a horse for a week, but will have a most brilliant time. And having that flexibility and knowing who you are and knowing your market, and it comes right back to what we were saying, which is if you know your audience and if you know the audience you want, and if you know the audience you want and you need to know about them, if you've done that diligence, you've got half a chance of solving the riddle. It's when you don't that you have none. Yeah.
Well said, Captain. So let's bring this to a close. Thanks again to Infinity Sports Travel. This is a lovely series that I'm really enjoying. Thanks to everybody listening. Thank you to James Gibb, our producer. And obviously today, Matt, who was fantastic. And Giles, for anybody that doesn't already follow us, you can follow us at our Entertained R on Twitter, and you can follow yourself on
at Giles Morgan 71. I'm always happy to hear from people, and I'm also really happy. I was having a look. We have lovely reviews from people. Keep them coming because it's just a really useful place for us. It's a great way to get feedback of what people want. So don't be shy, listeners. Tell us what you think.
Well, so you're saying that blocking immediately anybody that's it's got a criticism of us is not a good plan.
No, yeah, they're obviously not welcome.
Right, okay, I'll have to stop doing that. And you can follow me at RPM Como, as in the lake.
As in the lake. Roger, that was great fun. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.